Hello, I'm Barry Press, Artistic Director of Living Literature. For those of you who haven't seen our work before, Living Literature uses a reader's theater approach to share the written word. Using only the author's words, we edit and reshape the text to tell the story through multiple voices so that the characters and the events of the story become clearer and take on an extra vitality. To make the words come alive, as many people in our audience have said. We've been sharing our work in libraries, schools, and assisted living facilities and other social venues throughout the southeastern New England area for the past 24 years. And as we begin our 12th year in collaborating with Reading Across Rhode Island, we have a delightful book that we're going to be sharing with you, or an excerpt from, in just a few seconds. This version of the book concentrates on the first third of the novel, whose authors want to explore the source of racist ideas. So now, Marlon Carey and Phoenix Williams present a brief excerpt from Living Literature's Stamped: Racism, Anti-Racism, and You by Jason Reynolds and Ibram X. Kendi.
Before we begin, let's get something straight. This is not a history book, at least not like the ones you're used to reading in school.
The ones that make you feel more like a list of dates
There will be some.
with an occasional war here and there. Oh, a declaration,
Definitely got to mention that.
a constitution,
That too.
a court case or two, and of course, the paragraph that's read during Black History Month.
This isn't that. This isn't a history book, or at least it's not that kind of history book. Instead, what this is a book that contains history, a history directly connected to our lives as we live them right to this minute.
This book is about the here and now.
A book that will hopefully help us better understand why we are where we are as Americans, specifically as our identity pertains to race.
Uh-oh, the R word, which for many of us still feels R-rated.
Or can be matched only with another R word: run.
But don't.
Let us all just take a deep breath.
Inhale,
Hold it.
exhale, and breathe out.
Race. See? Not so bad.
Except for the fact that race has been a strange and persistent poison in American history.
Which I'm sure you already know. But I'm also sure that whatever, depending on where you are, or where you've grown up, or your experience with it,
Or at least a moment in which you recognize it.
may vary. Some may believe race is an issue that's not an issue anymore. That's a thing of the past.
Old tales of bad times.
And then there are those of you who know that race is still deadly, and more critical, racism is everywhere.
Those of you who see your racism regularly robbing people of liberty, whether as violent stick-ups or a slight pickpocket, the thief known as racism is all around.
This book, this not history book, is meant to take you on a race journey from then to now.
To show why we feel how we feel.
Why we live how we live.
And why this poison, whether recognizable or unrecognizable,
whether it's a scream or a whisper,
just won't go away.
There are 3 words I want you to keep in mind. 3 words to describe the people we will be exploring:
Segregationist,
assimilationist,
and anti-racist.
There are serious definitions of these things, but I'm going to give you mine. Segregationists are haters.
Like real haters. People who hate you for not being like them.
Assimilationists are people who like you, but only with quotation marks.
Meaning they like you because you're like them.
And then there are anti-racists.
They love you because you're like you.
And actually, these aren't just words we'll be using to describe people in this book. They're also the words we'll be using to describe you,
And me.
all of us.
So where do we start?
We might as well jump right in and begin with the world's first racist. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, how could anyone know who the world's first racist was?
Yeah, tell us so we can find out where he lives.
Well, he's dead. Been dead for 600 years.
Thankfully.
But before I tell you about him, I have to give you a little context. Europe, that's where he was. As I'm sure you've learned by now, the Europeans, Italians,
Portuguese,
Spanish,
Dutch,
French,
British.
were conquering everyone.
Because if there's one thing all history books do say, it's that Europeans conquered the majority of the world.
The year is 1415, and Prince Henry
There's always a Prince Henry.
convinced his father, King John of Portugal, to basically pull a caper and capture the main Muslim trading depot on the northeastern tip of Morocco.
Why?
Simple. Prince Henry was jealous. The Muslims had riches, and if Prince Henry could get the Muslims out of the way, then those riches and resources could be easily accessed.
Stolen. A robbery. Plain and simple.
They take a bountiful supply of gold.
And Africans.
That's right. The Portuguese were capturing Moorish people who would become prisoners of war. And by prisoners, I mean property.
Human property.
But neither Prince Henry nor King John of Portugal were given the title world's first racist, because the truth is, capturing people wasn't an unusual thing back then.
Just a fact of life.
That illustrious moniker would go to a man named Game Yane de Zurara.
Zurara. Sounds like a cheerleader chant.
He was a cheerleader, kind of. Not the kind who roots for the team and pumps up the crowd, but he was a man who makes sure that the team he played for was represented and heralded as great. He made sure Prince Henry was looked at as a brilliant quarterback, making ingenious plays, and that every touchdown was the mark of a superior player.
How did Zurara do this?
Through literature. He wrote the story, a biography of the life and slave trading of Prince Henry. It was called The Chronicle of the Discovery and Conquest of Guinea. In it, Zurara bragged about the Portuguese being early in bringing enslaved Africans from the Western Sahara Cape. And he spoke about owning humans as if they were exclusive pairs of sneakers. Again, this was common. But he upped the brag by also explaining what made Portugal different from their European neighbors in terms of slave trading. The Portuguese now saw enslaving people as missionary work.
A mission from God to help civilize and Christianize the African savages?
At least that's what Zurara claimed. And the reason this was a one-up on his competitors, the Spanish and Italian, was because they were enslaving Eastern Europeans, as in white people.
They not called white people back then.
Zurara's ace, his trick shot, was that the Portuguese had enslaved Africans,
Of all shades, by the way.
supposedly for the purpose of saving their wretched souls.
Zurara made Prince Henry out to be some kind of a youth minister, canvassing the street, doing community work, when what Prince Henry really was more of a gangster.
More shake and a kidnapper getting mission for bringing the king captives.
Seems like Zurara was just a liar, right? Like a fiction writer? So what makes him the world's first racist?
Well, Zurara was the first person to write about and defend Black human ownership. And this single document began the recorded history of anti-Black racist ideas. Zurara's book was a hit. And you know what hits do.
They spread like a like a pop song that everyone claims to hate, but everyone knows the words to, and then suddenly no one hates the song before no more. And instead, it becomes an anthem.
Zurawa's book became an anthem, a song sung all across Europe as the primary source of knowledge on unknown Africa and African people for the original slave traders and enslavers in Spain,
Holland
France.
and England.
Zurawa depicted Africans as savage animals that needed training.
This depiction over time would even begin to convince some African people they were inferior.
Zurawa's documentation of the racist idea the African needed slavery in order to be fed and taught Jesus, and that it was all ordained by God, began to seep in and stick to the European cultural psyche.
A few hundred years later, this idea would eventually reach America.
After Zurawa's ridiculous money-grabbing lie, there were other European race theorists who followed suit, using this text as a jumping-off point for their own concepts and racist ideas to justify the enslavement of Africans.
Because if there's one thing we know about all humans, it's that most of us are followers. And if they're and looking for something just to be a part of, to make us feel better about our own selfishness.
Anyway, the followers came sniffing around, drumming up their own cockamamie theories, two of which would set the table for the conversation around racism for centuries to come.
Climate theory. This actually came from Aristotle, who questioned whether Africans were born this way or if the heat of the continent made them inferior.
Many agreed it was climate, and that if African people lived in cooler temperatures, they could in fact become white.
Curse theory. In 1577, after noticing that Inuit people in northeastern freezing cold Canada were darker than the people living in the hotter South, an English writer determined that it couldn't have been climate that made darker people inferior, and instead determined that Africans were, in fact, cursed.
And what was used to prove this theory?
Only one of the most irrefutable books of all time, the Bible. In this interpretation of the book of Genesis, Noah orders his white sons not to have sex with their wives on the ark. And then tells them that the first child born after the flood would inherit the earth. Now, when the evil and hypersexual Ham had sex in the ark, God wills that Ham's descendants will be dark and disgusting, and the whole world will look at them as symbols of trouble. Simply put, Ham's kids will be black and bad, ultimately making black bad. Curse theory would become the anchor of what would justify American slavery.
It would branch off into another ridiculous idea, the strange concept that because Africans were cursed and because,
according to these Europeans,
they needed enslavement in order to be saved and civilized, the relationship between slave and master was loving.
More like parent and child.
Or minister and member.
Mentor and mentee.
A generation later, slavery touched down in the newly colonized America, and the people there to usher it in, and more important, to use it to build this new country, were two men, each of whom saw himself as a similar kind of do-gooder. Their names, John Cotton and Richard Mather.
They were Puritans. Now, Puritans were English Protestants who believed the Reformation of the Church of England was basically watering down Christianity, and they sought to regulate it to keep it more disciplined and rigid. So these two men, at different times, traveled across the Atlantic in the 1630s in search of a new land,
which would be Boston,
where they could escape English persecution and preach their version,
a purer version,
of Christianity.
Both men were ministers. They built churches in Massachusetts, but more importantly, they built systems. The church wasn't just a place of worship.
The church was a place of power and influence.
And in this new land, John Cotton and Richard Mather had a whole lot of power and influence. And the first thing they did to spread the Puritan way was to find other people who were like-minded. And with these like-minded folks, they created schools to enforce higher education skewed towards their way of thinking. The first university in America ever was Harvard University. With the opening of Harvard,
And a thing that connects directly to Zurara
and the curse and the climate theories,
and everything we've talked about thus far,
was that Cotton and Mather were students of one of the greatest Greek philosophers of all time, Aristotle. And Aristotle believed in human hierarchy. Aristotle believed that the Greeks were superior to all non-Greeks. John Cotton and Richard Mather took Aristotle's idea
because they too were followers.
and flipped it into a new equation, substituting Greek for Puritan. And because of their miraculous journeys around the raging seas, they believed they were the chosen people, special in the eyes of God.
Puritan superiority. According to the Puritans, they were better than
Native Americans,
English people who weren't Puritans,
everyone else who wasn't a Puritan.
especially African people.
And just like that, the groundwork was laid not only for slavery to be justified, but for it to be justified for a long, long time, simply because it was woven into the religious and educational systems of America.
All that was needed to complete this oppressive puzzle was slaves.
Thank you. We hope you will be encouraged to not only read this book, but to continue the conversations it engenders. We will be posting this excerpt on both the Center for the Books webpage and Living Literature's Facebook page, and we intend to have our full program available sometime in February. So check those websites for more specific information. Until then, and until we meet you in person, thanks for listening.